Okay, we'll get started again here on our second part of the discussion today on Arctic Chill. So let's focus on the novel here. Ended up talking about the on some points just about how the context is relevant here, and right away the issue of ethnicity comes up. And of course, it's like right from the first page, it's marked out as something important about this novel. What I was saying in part in response to the comments is that the novel is clearly trying to put ethnicity in the foreground and wants to talk about attitudes toward the changing of Icelandic society, right? I mean, it's a socially, we're back right in the sort of the wheelhouse of social criticism, right, where this is a novel that wants to take apart attitudes, and it seems, you know, you could argue, or I would say, it gets a broad variety of attitudes toward the changing Iceland, you could say, the globalization of Iceland, the, you know, Iceland's becoming a multicultural society, and wants to sort of give different people the opportunity to speak their mind and to put those discussions in conversation. And that's part of its social criticism, one might argue. So our job, in a way, is to try to unpack that a little bit and figure out some elements of it. And that's part of that ethical task that we talked about in the first part of the meeting, that you confront a society. There's clearly different attitudes probably than are a big part of American public debate. But maybe they are. Maybe some of these attitudes, there's anti-immigrant attitudes, aren't that different than what we find, for example, in certain positions in American public debate that say, build a fence, we need a fence along the border, or whatever it is. So we can see how another society deals with these issues. It's a very different society than ours. So, but at the same time, right, I said, I mean, I think this is like, to come back to Bailey's initial point, this is kind of a historicist novel. It wants to talk about a specific debate, and it's not advocating for that there's a certain response or there's a historical necessity that's going to carry the day, but it looks at it as a debate, it seems, and seeks to explore it. And maybe is an intervention in its own way, trying to take part too. You can make up your mind about that. Anyway, Arctic Chill. I just noticed the Icelandic title. In this case, it's like the one novel of all the five we've read where the Icelandic title and the English title are almost the same. So Arctic Chill and the Icelandic title loosely translated would be Winter City. So that's, I mean, we could think, you know, what's the difference between, I mean, Arctic Chill's a little more lyrical, I guess, and more sort of abstract. Winter City is maybe a little more dreary, concrete. But nevertheless, they both have that notion of season, cold. So any comparisons, Winter City, Arctic Chill, Gabrielle?
I don't know, there's a little part in the back of my head that compared Winter City and Arctic Chill to the Seattle Freeze.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Where, like, it might not necessarily be about the weather, but, like,
right.
The people that live there.
Absolutely. That's clearly, well, you kind of beat me to the punch here, because what I was going to ask is what associations we might have. What if we just start with the title? What does Arctic Chill mean? And then I've told you Winter City as well. We don't know. I don't know if that's an idiom like the Seattle Freeze. I mean, it'd be interesting to write a novel, Seattle Freeze, right? You know, about a specific event. You could do it, right? Where there was some unseasonable weather event, right? They just closed I-90 yesterday. Just don't call me, I guess, because it was such heavy snow. Where you could figure out some kind of like actual event like that, you know, the snowstorm that knocked out Nichols or whatever, you know, and use that as a way to reflect on these things. Actually, if you're interested in reading some interesting novels, a really interesting novel about Seattle, maybe a little before when like you guys were like 10, 12, there's an amazing novel by a novelist named Jonathan Rabin, R-A-B-A-N, called Waxwings, about Seattle during the dot-com bubble. And if you want like a fun book to read over, it's just like amazing author. This is not crime fiction, but literary fiction. A fun book to read over the break if you're looking for something outside your usual stuff. That's a good one, but it's kind of an interesting one. It's got ethnicity. It's got these things. I think the protagonist is like some kind of dissolute professor from the UW or something like that. But it's not an academic novel at all. But very much about, and I mean, he's getting rich too, right? He's got some kind of consulting thing he's going to do or whatever. But it's an interesting perspective. Jonathan Rabin is a English guy who is an expatriate, lives in Seattle here. Anyway, that's just an aside. The point was to go to what Gabrielle was saying about how Seattle Freeze is not just about the weather. So let's actually just start there. 2 questions. What associations are there with this title? And then how is Arctic Chill thematized into the novel here? Let's just take it as a whole class here, reflecting on how Arctic Chill, like actual events in the plot or in the story in which Arctic Chill is present. But then second, what associations are there with that title? What does the title mean, in other words? Anyone? Yeah. Right, so let's see here. So Austin points out cold-blooded killing. Just our metaphor for cold blood, our metaphor for particularly grisly or amoral kind of killing, to kill in cold blood, where the temperature, right, in some ways is called to mind by the title of the novel. Yeah, good place to start. Other thoughts that come to mind just thinking about it? Yeah, Kathleen.
Detectives, they lost their brother in the blizzard.
Okay, another one here. So, Erlander. This is one of the things that this Indridesen does, is that many of the crimes in the novel are there's like structural similarities between the crime and Erlander's own history, right? So that here we have the 2 brothers, right? And what happened to him? He and his brother were out on the moors or whatever, the mountains in Iceland, way out in the nowhere, and the brother died in the blizzard, right, when Erlander let his hand go. So the 2 brothers, right, they're in a way it doubles for him. Another one too that keeps coming back is, and we see in this novel, what happens to Niram, and what happens to Niram most of the novel, right? He's a missing person, and so this is another one, and there's a lot of reflection. Erlander does a lot of reflecting on missing persons, and the missing person is the Icelandic crime. And there's this woman who keeps calling and who seems to be he links her in his mind to this domestic abuse situation that has been part of another investigation and she's missing, right? She's run away or something like that. Turns out murdered or suicide, some kind of other. So this whole theme of the missing person is an important part of Erlander's personal history as well as this story. Other things from the title, yeah.
An isolated place and also isolated minorities.
Okay, so Arctic Chill. So you're saying that's like
Pretty isolated from the rest of the world.
Isolation, and then we have isolation of minorities in Iceland. So that figuratively, right, that the people who are involved in the crime are all isolated by the weather in the same way that, there's like an echo there of some kind. Yeah, great. Yeah, Austin. Okay, so we could just like Icelandic and Thai differences. I mean, one that thematizing the title, that's kind of thematization, right? Where something in the title gets repeated in a way that signals to the reader that this is important to think about. I mean, one thing to ask is, too, I mean, is that what is the title going for that equation, where it's kind of an allegory, right? Where the title is trying to say this is Iceland, right? I mean, I think some of the things people have said have implied that, right? Where that's to read the title and argue that it's really trying to take this crime and talk about it as almost in an allegorical way, where the characters represent certain types in Icelandic society. It's an argument, it's an analysis of Iceland. Iceland, obviously, is a version of Winter City or Arctic Chill, too. Iceland. It's the same name in Iceland, Island. Other thoughts about the title? Yeah, Christine.
I've just been going from the last book, the whole Department Q, with all this joking and rude to people, but going to this one, it seems really serious.
Yeah.
And it has a lot to do with the weather and the cold that people are hunting against it. They don't talk to their neighbors. And it's not what word I was going to use. I don't know.
Okay. Well, if it comes back to mind, share it with us. But yeah, definitely. There's I think that Arctic Chill. It's not like an inviting title, right? It's like ooh, very dreary title. That wasn't the right noise, I don't think. Dreary title. Serious tone. You know, you can hardly call a title like sexy or something like that, right? It's like kind of foreboding, almost not inviting at all, right? Arctic Chill, right? You kind of bundle up. So the title obviously sets. Many people choose the book you're going to read based on the title, right? And so here we have an instance where that title is kind of not that inviting. The other thing is, too, it says, just as a subtitle, a Reykjavik thriller. Is this a thriller? I guess that was my question I was going to work up to later. But it's not a thriller at all, really, is it? I mean, there's not really. It's a police procedural, and there's almost like a whodunit aspect to it, where there's very limited kind of. I mean, they don't have any real ideas of the suspects, but it's kind of that small Icelandic sort of social scope makes it seem like they know the suspects. Maybe a little bit of whodunit. Anyway, okay. Already in the discussion, so these are some things that I think the point about these points all in some ways resonate. Arctic Chill, isolation, cultural differences in the title, Winter City, Iceland as a country, cold-blooded killing, all these things, the serious tone. All of them signal to us that the issues in the novel have to do with very strongly with the setting and Iceland. So, in a way, this is a novel that wants to talk about Icelandic society. And Icelandic society, in some ways, is emblematic of struggles over, in particular, locality and cultural difference that are familiar from other parts of the world. So let's take a look at that. People already mentioned in talking about context here what matters. Ethnicity, nationality. And actually, I'm going to give you, I'll just choose a passage here and ask you to talk about it. And the passage is this one, page 4, from the very beginning of the investigation. And what I'd like to ask is, what are the issues around ethnicity here? Just trying to talk about. I just unpack this. What issues are here in this novel? If you think of this as the first, where they identify this victim as a child, right? Who he looks Asian to me. One of them say so. Just I want you to read this and think about what the issues are that are part of this. So where do you think he's from? This Sigurdur Oli wondered. The young, kind of more Americanized cop. He looks Asian to me, Ellenborg says. This is the woman officer. Could be Thai, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, Chinese. Sigurdur Oli battled off. Shouldn't we say that he's an Icelander until we find out otherwise? Erlander said. So what I'd like you to do is make a list of 2 or 3 things that are issues around ethnicity here. That could be like how ethnicity is being understood or how nationality is resonating here. What are the things that we need to pay attention to based on what we find in this passage? So in a way, you're making an agenda for how we can deal with issues of ethnicity, nationality, race in the novel based on this passage, which is where it really first gets introduced in the novel. So let's take a couple minutes to do that with people sitting next to you, and then we'll talk about it as a class.
Well, their initial assumption is that it doesn't look like it's from somewhere. It's not from so he was born in saying it right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was wondering where two Icelanders were to make I mean, like, there's but for me, for like anyone else, when Iceland how do you even, like, if there was some person from
But I don't know
Story. Like 10 years ago, I was taking a guy from Alaska.
Those other people.
At the dinner table, my mom was talking about how my sister dating someone that was
what a setup. this, and try to use those everywhere because they don't know
Well, I mean, that's kind of the power to categorize, like, is the power to assign entities to location and of course, it's the one any of the institution can do that, which is because of power. Just like you can go in a room and say, okay, let's categorize you with this grade point average or whatever. That's like making a certain distinction. That, whatever. So, I
yeah, and that relates to power.
yeah. So like, oh, these people, there's other ones over this side. Yeah, I mean that would be one aspect of it, was just that when Iceland speaks, it's just Iceland speaking. But when everyone speaks of this, somehow they don't represent Iceland. So that's one of the problems that lies the whole time, right? So neat, right? Is that they're somehow like pushing on members of Iceland society, they're not, right? So they get maybe represent something that yeah, excellent.
Do you know if the rules in Iceland are about make sure
I don't know the specifics. I'm guessing that it's the same as the other Scandinavian countries where if you are born to, I mean, the rules are usually that, well, I was talking to the class. So Susan was asking, before we start, what are the rules, like how are you an Icelander or not an Icelander? That, in the other Scandinavian countries, if you're born to two people who are citizens, and you're born in the country, you're automatically counted as a citizen. So there's not the policy, like, for example, people may know that in Germany for years, people could be permanent residents, Turkish people could be, there are many Turkish people who were like second, third generation living in Germany, totally German in many ways, and yet they were not German citizens because their parents were Turkish. And so in Scandinavia, those laws have been changed in many ways so that if you're born to people who are themselves citizens, you become a citizen, right? There's not these sorts of long-term permanent residents who aren't actually citizens. But if you're born to a person who is where the mother is Icelandic and the father is Finnish or Icelandic or whatever, you're automatically, if the mother is a national citizen, you're automatically granted citizenship. But if the father is, then there's like a more complicated process, but it's granted nevertheless. But for example, if you were born in Iceland, just like if you living in Iceland, you're born and like you are living in Iceland, you have a child or your partner has a child, and that child is not an Icelandic citizen, right? You don't get national. That's the way it works in the United States, right? So it's an ethnic categorization of citizenship, not a political one like we have in the United States. So that's a big difference between the Scandinavian countries and the US. So that, as I mentioned before, that's like, for example, in Denmark, that's been one of these really contentious issues about citizenship. So here we have, when they say an Icelander, it's an ethnic identity, not a citizenship definition. But what did you come up with in thinking about this passage? Hannah.
We just learning how he kind of lists off all the different ethnicities that he could possibly be there under the Asian category, as opposed to taking the time to figure out what kind of Asian he actually was.
Okay.
It seemed like they just didn't really care that much, besides the fact that he was Asian. They didn't really care what exactly he was.
Okay, so if I understand you right, you're saying that they're, I mean, of course, they're like, it's like the crime scene, but that kind of listing is superficial.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Casey, you had your hand up?
Well,
Okay. Right. So there's a big jump that goes on, right, where there's sort of the appearance of different leads to immediate differentiation. And, kind of there's this, at the end, right, this kind of correction. Well, that's not a fair... the assumptions are clear, in other words. Assumptions being made. Kaya?
Yeah, going off of that, you're talking, there's kind of an insensitivity towards foreign culture.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, we were just talking about how it's like the child is white and not foreign looking, then they probably wouldn't be listening in such like a distant way.
Okay, so that it's not only that there's assumptions, but there's a kind of almost like an objectification. I was talking to Shuandra, and she was pointing out that like there's a category, there's almost like an attempt to categorize Thai, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, and when you categorize, right, you objectify, and so despite the sense of that is, you put someone in a classificatory scheme, and under that understand them as representation of the scheme rather than as an individual. And so, in a way, then you could say that. I mean, that's the kind of. I'm not saying that he's like objectifying the kid so much as the logic, right, does that. Bailey.
Also, like all of those ethnicities aren't all. Asians kind of really broad. There's Southeast Asian, there's Pacific Islander, so like the fact that they don't, they use this very overarching term as opposed to, I don't know. I mean, a lot of white people have a hard time determining like what type of Asian somebody is.
Yeah.
It's broken out into a lot of different.
Right. So it's this. There's like an aspect of point of view where Asian is just Icelander, right? I mean, to the Icelander, it's just Asian, and then the Sigurd, he tries to like go a step further and say, actually, I know about a little bit about Asia, and then sort of list out what countries he knows in Asia, right? But in a way, it's almost a bigger sort of misstep on his part because he shows, in a way, how little he knows, right? It's almost like, those kinds of things where that term that's kind of dropped out of American usage, which is like Oriental, right? But if you read about, like, watch a Charlie Chan movie or something like that, see those kinds of things where it's this real sort of like othering of and of course that is part of we don't see it so much in this novel maybe, but an old sort of trope of Asia, right? The mysterious Oriental. We can't understand those people, right? We can't understand their language. This is sort of like the American point of view, where one of the things that we see here is like that very strong point of view come out, where the position of the person doing the categorizing stands. Gabrielle, you've had your hand up for a while.
I talked to my group about how there's a difference between kind of like the socially constructed race versus like the biological race. Because everybody like has a biological race, but race in itself is very socially constructed. And so like in this particular passage, like we talked about how they're kind of making it a black or white kind of thing, where it's like this child can't be both.
Right. I mean, we talked a little bit about this when we talk about ethnicity. That actually, people have really rejected the notion of or the scientists, right? Have especially with the genome research, have rejected or heavily qualified the notion of biological race because no matter where you're from, it's like 99.9% the same. So the notion of biological race is really kind of taken a drubbing, but that doesn't mean that there's not like heavily marked notions of ethnicity and differentiation. One of the things that we see here on your comment, right, is a kind of a slippage, right, where biological race is invoked, and then that kind of stands for ethnicity, where if we know some kind of idea of biological race, that's enough to figure things out when it's really talking about something else. So, or issues maybe elsewhere. So there's kind of like a confusion that's caused by the comments. Agnes?
I think the conversation was controversial because it's coming from police.
Uh-huh.
A police conversation. So we would kind of expect them to be a bit more non-emotion related, not putting so much like emotion into their part of the conversation. Excellent
point. Yeah, think about Seattle Police Department right now, like federal Department of Justice investigation and sort of attempts to deal with violence by the Seattle Police Force because of findings that there have been pattern of the use of violence against ethnic minorities and so forth, right? Where the way police officers talk can impact the kinds of actions they take, and if they're talking like this, I mean, whatever you think about it, might that cause them to act in a way that would differentiate between people, for example? So, it's the same way we recognize the way journalists talk about crimes, for example, where the way that a suspect is identified or when a victim is identified. So this is another issue to think about where we have that kind of comparison. Other points? Yeah, Austin.
But even though they are what they say is they're kind of making, or at least secretive.
Yeah.
They're trying to make an attempt at being politically correct. He's saying, well, he's not just gay, he could do a bunch of different things. And then they say, yeah, he could even be an Icelander. So they're trying to backtrack and be politically correct. They're still making an effort, even though it's maybe not.
Right. It's sort of there's a dialogue here, right, where there's different perspectives that are being introduced. Cigarrola, right, he kind of puts his foot in it, but in a sense, like from our perspective, and at the same time, he's like making the effort to say, I'm not trying to just paint with a broad brushstroke here, but I recognize the implication of my comment, and then Erlander, of course, is trying to correct him at the same time and say, hey, don't make those assumptions at all. So we have some different perspectives here, and that's one of the things that's maybe an important point of the novel to take away from here, is that there's a lot of different perspectives that are put into conversation. Susan, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, I think one thing we're missing about context, and I'm going to be a devil's advocate here. When you're a homicide inspector and you come on a dead child at a scene of the crime, the single first and most important thing to do is identify the victim.
Okay.
Because that gets you closest to finding out.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't unusual at a crime scene, at a discovery of a body, for the cops to sit around and talk about who do we think the victim is, where are our investigative leads taking us. Now, 3 citizens had just come across the body, had this conversation. I think you could say, depending on what the purpose of the conversation was, of the people talking, it has a little bit of a different read. I don't disagree with what's being said. But
right.
In the context of an immediate death and a homicide investigation, identifying the victim is really critical, and that includes all parts of
right.
observations.
Excellent point, or sort of challenge to the way we've been doing the analysis. That anyone ever called 911, right? When you're reporting some crime, they ask you racial questions, right? What's the race of the person? Because they're doing the quick and dirty to try to identify or the victim or whatever. Among other questions, what's the build, what's the height, what's whatever. And so here we're in a similar kind of moment, right, where they're asking these things because they're working as quickly as possible to identify things. And in a society that is probably a lot more, it is a lot more homogeneous than ours, this could be an important way of identifying the person. Right? So, other points. Let's take a look at another passage here. I just thought, since this is the question, and what I'd like to do is just from this conversation is take away like some points, some further questions, and so that is like what's going on with ethnicity here. That's what the novel wants to talk about in many ways. So what are the questions we need to ask? That's what I'd like you to sort of talk about. What questions do we need to ask this novel about the way that ethnicity is being depicted? And so let's turn to a little bit later example where Erlander is speaking with Elias's grandmother, right? So she's an ethnic Icelander as well, Sigríður. And they're talking about, like, he's trying to figure out, are there things in the family, or what might be the potential motives for the murder of this Elias? And so this is her reply to him. You can look on page 53 if you want more info. But what I'd like to do is take a look at this passage and ask yourself talk about what's going on here. Same question. But instead of making arguments about what's going on, let's just ask, what questions do we need to figure, or let's try to figure out what questions do we need to ask about ethnicity in this novel? Okay? So talk about that for a few minutes, and we'll talk about it as a class. Right, because Erlander, if you remember from the novel, Erlander's line of questioning here is if the brother might be the killer.
What's interesting is there's over and over again some kind of dialogue about those kind of things that people automatically jump in and accuse them of racism. No, it does. It does. Obviously, there must be. Yeah, there must be some kind of racism.
Okay, let's turn back to the class here, and the question was then, as much as a little bit what's going on here, but more than that, what questions do we need to ask the novel about ethnicity? Yeah, Charlie.
Would Erlander think that his brother had killed him if these were like stereotypical Icelandic humans?
Right. So, is there a difference here being drawn? Would you ask the same question in an Icelandic family? Was the brother the killer? So maybe that's one thing that is just to try to draw some comparisons or look at the way comparisons are made. Because, of course, that's, in some ways, is what point of view, right? Like, the place where you're asking the question from shapes the kind of question you might ask. And if you're the one in sort of control or in power, is there something different among those people, right, that I don't understand that leads to that this sort of line of questioning? Good start. Any other thoughts or questions that people think we would need to raise? Tracy? I don't know the answer to the question. But it's a. I can say that I mean, like the places I have lived in the Nordic countries, and following the media, it's a different kind of conversation we have here. And I think in part, I don't know. People could. I don't know what your views are of American society, but one of the things that I think you probably can say about American society is that we have this horribly ugly, history of racism and institutionalized racism, slavery, and so forth. That, in a way, you could say. I mean, people say like that's the big story in the United States, race, right? That we don't talk about. It's like our repressed. We try to avoid it, whatever. It's always there, and we can all think of the way that that's a part of the fabric of American life. But because it's so present in a way, we're also aware of it, and we can talk about it, and we can deal with it in different ways, in different contexts, and everyone kind of knows about it, right? That and has these particular perspectives and conversations in past they can pull up. They don't have that so much here, and so my experience, I always feel like it's very naive in a way. Like the things I hear, for example, I remember in Finland, there's a big Somali population there, and there was some sort of like fighting in some school just outside Helsinki where there was like violence along race lines, right? And so the tabloid there, they had these pictures of faces kind of like digitally blanked out so you couldn't see the faces, but it's like some clearly like ethnically white Finnish kid like this, and then like some Somali kid like that. You put a picture like that on the newspaper, you don't need to write anything, right? It's like this clear like attempt to use race to tell the story. And as it turned out, if you like that particular incident, the Somalis weren't the attackers, right? They were actually the victims, right? Of course, you put it in a bigger context, these people who've come to this, it's like they've come to the Arctic Chill, right? I mean, but so I think one of the things that you see is a little bit of maybe the kind of racism, racial tension might in some ways get stoked by the way the stories get told, and so that's why maybe in a way it's also important to think about the way the story gets told here and pay attention to it. Of course, that's really that's the point. Like you may ask yourself, what do you get from a novel like this? But it's an opportunity to think about how the story gets told and notice the ways in which it tries to deal with issues of ethnicity or race and make you think about it. And maybe we would have different ones, or we see what we wouldn't do here as much as what we may think is helpful. But so I think that I guess my response to you is I don't know the answer about for this particular Icelandic thing about it. You can say that there's these strong anti-immigrant parties that are trying to win votes and get political power by campaigning in overtly racist ways or covertly racist ways, and that has been a big part of public conversation there for the last 20 years, and particularly the last 10. So that's a part of Iceland discussion too. Other questions we need to ask. Case is a good one though. Like what's really going on there? You could always look at the media and find out reporting too. Other things. We're kind of coming to the end here. There's some other questions I have, but we can in some ways put them off a little bit. But let me just leave them with you so you can think about them as you're reading. Another way to think about this would be like, what are the points of view on ethnicity in this novel? To try to like gain out a little bit what the different perspectives are and what differentiates them. So that's one thing. Second one, to transition to a little bit different set of questions is that once again we have this child victim or a child involved in the crime, and that's something we've talked a lot about so far. So one thing to do would be to kind of compare and contrast the way in which the child is depicted here in this novel with other novels we've read so far. Clearly, then we have these characters. For Thursday, we'll talk about the anti-hero. Erlander is clearly an anti-hero, right? He's got his personal life is in a shambles for the most part. Strained relations to his daughter, collapsed marriage from 20 years ago he's never really dealt with, personal traumas, addiction in the family, and so forth. So his character is an interesting one, and then we have these other interesting characters as well. The family, right? Suni, Niram, Elias, Odin, the divorced husband, and then the other cops, right, are present as well, and interesting in their way. And then finally, it's like a police procedural that we mentioned already. So what? Is there comparisons and contrasts we can make to other novels so far? So think about that genre, the child, character, as you read, and we can pick up on some of those issues on Thursday. But for now, I'll say so long.